Shireen Hunter, how are you? It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Very
Thank you
nice
so
to
much.
be with you,
Thank you.
Shahid.
Dr. Shireen, so you are an academic. You're from Iran originally,
That's
in
right.
living in the USA, and you're an academic and a professor. You've also written a book. Would you tell us a little bit about the book that you've written recently?
Well, I have written several books, but my last book is essentially is a sort of a memoir, but it's a kind of a political memoir, partly because of my own life and my family's life were so much impacted by the developments, international developments, and that's why that I titled it "The Great Powers and Iran's Social and Political Evolution," a memoir, and so it really. It is more about me and about my family, where I was born, and which was in northwestern Iran in the Azerbaijan province.
Oh,
And
really?
yes, the Azerbaijan province. And the fact that, proximity to Russia and who made it very vulnerable, but also in general, the impact of Russo-Iranian wars on Iran's and development, but also the British-Russian rivalry in the context of the so-called the Great Game. I mean,
Mhm.
Iran was seen as really people talk about Afghanistan, but it was really Iran was the first barrier to, coming from India. You get to Afghanistan, but what do? They wanted to have Iran so that to block Russia's access to the Persian Gulf, and then through India, whether by land or by sea, mostly by sea, and all these things affected Iran's development. But even before that, Iran is geopolitically situated in a way that it has been, unfortunately, on the route of both great migrations. I mean, the Indo-Iranian people also came from somewhere else and settled in the Iranian plateau and then went to northern India, which includes, of course, the present-day Pakistan. And so, but what this has meant is that it has created great fissures inside Iran. The biggest one, of course, was after the Arab invasion. And, with the Arab invasion and the Iranians becoming Muslim, uh, the whole Iranian civilization was sort of fractured, and that has created issues. Then the worst, of course, was the Mongol invasion, and it created not only great destruction, not just in Iran, but in Central Asia as well. Um, and then linguistic problems because of the Turco-Mongol people settling in certain parts of Iran, including where I am from.
Yeah. It's so interesting when you talk about the great game. It's amazing how things never change. It's like we kind of is when you talk about the great game, it's hard to tell if you're talking about history or if you're talking about current day at the moment.
Well,
Um,
in the book, I look. I don't really address the issue of the great game. I'm looking at Iran. I mean, what has
mm,
made Iran's present condition?
yeah,
And I'm trying to get into look at it and to say that Iran's current problems have very deep roots. I mean, for
yes,
example, currently in Iran, and of course, it has always existed. There is some one of the divisions within the Iranian polity is really um, those who really don't want for Iran to have any role as a focus of identity or so on. It is what they call Iranianism. They want everything to be Islam, but
mm,
but there are other people who feel otherwise, and I think
yes,
this is I argue with them, this is very unrealistic because unfortunately, or whatever, religion alone has never been sufficient glue to keep people together. And it has been more successful when it has strengthened some ethnic roots and so on and so forth. But
Yes.
the current regime, because it has ideologized Islam, it really has turned, in fact, Ali Shariati, one of the great ideologues of the revolution, he said, our achievement was that we turned Islam from culture into ideology. So when it becomes ideology, then it's therefore has become very much connected with power. And so there is this tug of war
Yes.
between Iranianism and Islamism. What I am trying to show them that this started because of the Arab invasion. Iran had a cohesive,
Mm.
I don't mean that there were no differences, but there was an Iranian civilization. They had a cosmology, they had their
Apart.
own theories of creation and everything, which frankly many of the Abrahamic religions were inspired by it. We don't say that, but Zoroastrianism um, inspired a lot of the concepts of heaven and
Yeah.
hell and good and evil and so on. So I think that these are some of the issues that I discuss, and I say how it has impacted Iran's evolution. Um, and also then
You're
I
right. I mean, yeah, sorry.
then I
Go
was
ahead.
talking how it has impacted my own life. I say, for example, the Second World War, Iran tried to remain neutral, but the Allied forces would not allow it because they needed the Iranian route to go to help the Soviet Union, whereas Turkey, that had much more closer relation with the Nazi Germany, remained neutral for whatever reason. I think partly had to do with the British policy. The British really disliked the Persians.
Right.
There's a famous saying. There's a famous saying. It says that I don't know whether it's 100% true, but anyway, it's a famous saying that the British say that keep the Arabs well fed and the Persians hungry, because if they
I've
get
read this as
anything,
well. That's right.
if they get anything in their belly, then they will start thinking of empire or whatever. So, but during that Russian occupation, my father was imprisoned, and he was poisoned, and so I lost my father when
Oh
I
no,
was
sorry.
only 3 months old. And I just say how this shaped my own trajectory of my life and my character and all that. So it's mostly personal, but with a very strong, how shall I say, um,
Yeah.
political and international flavor. Yes.
But you can tell me. So tell me a little bit about your background in Iran. How did you grow up? Where did you grow up? And also, I think you were part of the civil service in Iran. Is that right as well?
Foreign service, yes. Well,
The foreign service.
yeah, I grew up in Tabriz. My father was, well, of course, I never really saw my father, but my father was a doctor and was educated in Germany and all that. But of course, he died when I was only 2 months. So I lived with my mother and my mother's family. And my mother's family, particularly my grandmother, were what we call in French haute bourgeoisie. It was my mother's father was a big banker and landowner and all that. But by the time I had come, things had changed. In other words, fortunes had, a part of it was again because of revolutions. Um, my grandfather, unfortunately, I never met him because he was dead by the time I was born, but he was a conservative man. And so he was, you know, pro royalty during the constitutional revolution. And so he spent a lot of his money well, anyway, but I talk a little bit about the constitutional revolution, and I try to show that the myths are so different from the history. a lot of the characters that today we call them like heroes. I mean, and one of the characters I discuss is considered a national hero in Iran, but he really basically was a horse thief. And my grandfather several times obtained a pardon for him from the crown prince. And my grandmother was the daughter of a very prominent civil servant, and then her brothers also became ministers and so on and so forth. So it was a very kind of upper, not aristocratic, but upper class upbringing. But what I call in my book in later years, I call it turned into what the English 19th century English novels called genteel poverty. I mean, relatively speaking. So that's, and then we went to Tehran, and when we went to Tehran, it was during the Mossadegh era. And I also talk about that and say that the Mossadegh myth has been exaggerated. You know, what we had in Iran at the time was not really democracy, but it was a kind of a chaos. And so these are some of the issues that if anybody reads the book, which there is a big if, uh, they are going to take objection to it. But
Sure.
so yes, and then of course I went to university in Tehran, and then I entered the Foreign Service. I was one of the two girls that was admitted, but then I was the only one that first went to serve abroad. My first posting was in London, where you are sitting now, and
Wow.
I enjoyed it. Yes.
When was this? What year was this?
I got to London in early 1967, and I left in mid-July 1971.
Wow. So that was quite, there was a lot happening around that
There
time.
is quite a lot. It ages me, but there you are.
Mm.
That's right.
So,
And I studied at London School of Economics for my master, although I was working full time, but I was, I was a sort of a driven person those days.
wow, that's amazing. It's a lovely place to study and yeah, historic
That's right.
place. So when did you immigrate to America, and what was the circumstances that you had to leave your own country?
Well, that's I have to say. Well, to begin with, uh, during the from 1974 until about December 79, I was posted in Geneva in the Iranian mission to the United Nations. And I was then studying for my doctorate at the Graduate Institute of International Affairs. And so when I went to the United States, it wasn't with the objective of migrating. I was just had the fellowship to go to Harvard for several months. And because I wanted to research about my thesis, and so it was really I didn't go with the intention of immigrating. Actually, my mother, when finally she came to see me in December of 79, which was the last time I saw her, um, we said, okay, in March we will meet in London, and then we see what is going to happen. But then, revolution happened, and then unfortunately the developments took a turn that made it very clear that it would not be safe for me to go back. I certainly wouldn't have any career, and so so I stayed, and then my husband, whom I had known for some time, and I, decided to get married, and that's how it happened. It happened,
So,
and I am very grateful. I'm very grateful. I have to say, we complain a lot about America, especially now, but America has been a refuge for an awful lot of people,
yeah,
and
I think that's true.
including for me. Yes.
I think the difficulty with America is, it's one thing for people inside America, and it's slightly different when you're on the receiving end of things, whether you're in Latin America or Middle East or anywhere really. Because
Yeah.
it's such a powerful country. I think they say when America sneezes, Europe gets a cold.
Well, the point is, in general, it has to do with the great powers.
Mm.
There is the imperative of power, unfortunately, and that if you have it, your tendency is to use it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
because it has to do with, I think, really, frankly, it has to do with human nature. The more I
Yes,
have looked into things, I mean, when people say what are the origins of war and what is really causes all this, it is human nature. It really, you look,
yes,
I mean, we complicate things, or according to the new academic jargon, we problematize them. We problematize
yes,
them. Everything is quite simple. What is it? It's greed, power, desire for domination, which unfortunately exists. One of the problems I have, and in this my book, I also discuss it, and in that I say that one reason the great powers managed to harm Iran so much is because the Iranian leadership was corruptible,
yeah,
was corruptible. I mean, if they were not so corrupt, the king, of course, the people who ruled Iran at the time, they were not Iranian. I mean, they were, the Qajars were Turkic tribes that the Safavids brought and so on. But nevertheless, so they didn't have the emotional attachment. Since the Arab invasion, the only groups in Iran, which then their number has dwindled, certainly after the revolution, a lot of them completely left, were the kind of the little sort of, I don't mean intellectual, but what historically used to be called Dabiran, the sort of bureaucracy and the middle class, had kept Iran and Iranian traditions. But if you look at the, for example, destiny of all the Iranian reformist prime ministers, they were killed. I mean,
yeah,
by the kings, Amir Kabir or Maram Farahani and so on, admittedly under the instigation a little bit of the British, mostly British, but in some other cases by the Russians. But if the Iranians were not willing to sell themselves to either the British or to the Russians, this situation would not have happened. And the sad fact is that although the Islamic Republic says that they have a independent policy, you still have pro-Russian elements in the government, and you have people who would like to end this madness and stop the conflict with the United States. So I think that now I personally believe that a good human being will not exploit someone else's weaknesses. If somebody is a weak character, I shouldn't go and exploit that weakness and damage it. And this
yeah,
applies to the powers and international relations. But human nature being what it is,
yeah.
that's what happened. We didn't have weakness and corruption, let's say in Iran or some other thing. Great powers could not have done as much damage as they have.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. I think you're right. I think corruption is a problem throughout developing countries around the world. And it's a very difficult thing to figure out whether we're corrupt, we're having problems because we're corrupt, or we're corrupt because of the influence from outside. Because at the end of the day, in most developing countries, whether it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, a lot of the countries that you see in Syria, Middle East, um, it's not popular governments. It's not governments that they elected themselves. So it's governments that got enforced on them decades ago, and it's just generation after generation. Is kind of hard to shake anything and hard to make reforms within that system.
I would say that you are partially correct. But one of the problems in general, I think that the Arab world is somewhat more different, is somewhat different. But what I call, let's say, that Southwest Asia, Iran, Pakistan,
Yeah,
Afghanistan, and so on. I think some of the problems is because of the same factors that I talked about in the case of Iran, and Pakistan is less affected, but a little bit. Is that partly because of the length of history and partly because of this massive movements of peoples and the recurring invasions by foreigners and so on. Uh, their ethnic and then, of course, sectarian later um, um, composition is become very fragmented.
yeah,
Uh, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, the major problem really was the Pashtun irredentism and Pashtun ambitions. Since the creation of, and of course, I would have to say that the British had a role in that because the British, for a variety of reasons, wanted to undermine the Persian cultural influence. And,
yes,
you know, they call the Afghan language Dari. Well, that Farsi Dari, the Dari Persian, which means the Persian that came after the Arab invasion. I remember at a conference, I had an argument with a Afghan colleague, and he was saying Dari is a different language. And I told him, I said, will you concede that Hafiz of Shiraz was Iranian, was Persian? He said, oh, yeah, yes. And I said, well, what do you say when Hafiz says that the only person can understand Hafiz's poetry is the one that who has delicacy of taste and speaks Dari? I say, I rest my case. So you see, this also BBC has a program in Farsi and has a program in Dari and another program on Tajik. Why? Because they don't want the Persian speaking up. In India, under the Mughal emperors, Persian was the academic and administrative language.
yeah,
Well, when the British came, eliminated that. So what I'm
yeah,
saying is that a lot of the problems occurred. In Afghanistan, I think the diversity is very deep. You have the sort of Iranian origin people, which are the Tajiks. Then you have Uzbeks. Then you have Hazaras. And then even among them. And then you have, in general, the Pashtun desire to Pashtunize
yes,
Afghanistan culturally, and are not under these conditions. You cannot have a democratic government.
yeah,
Democracy is based on um, compromise and on
yes,
a certain common interest. I mean, I am going to say this. I mean, I think that people talk about the state democracy is under threat in the United States and so on. Well, part of that is because of changes in the partly it changes in the demographic shifts within the United States.
very
U.S.,
true.
50 years ago was a largely Anglo-European, I would put, because Germans is got Anglo-European and Protestant country. Now it is a very diverse group of people, and I think now maybe Catholics are in majority. I have no idea. So, the conflicts in America has become deeper. All these reactions to they talk about polarization and so on and so forth, and the same thing in the UK. I mean, this is unfortunately what happens. So.
Yeah.
Um, so part of it has to do with that. And the other thing is that, in general, a lack of economic development. Democracies thrive under the conditions of economic well being and peace. None of these countries have these, So
Mm.
when we look at the Latin America, for example, it's Latin America's problems did not start with the United States. Latin American problems started with the Spanish conquest, and then later the settlement of other Europeans. So what you have in Latin America, you have a massive indigenous population or mixed population whose economic conditions are not good. And then you have an elite which is either European or mixed with some Europeans. So problems are far more, fundamental. Admittedly, some policies have been deleterious. I personally think that U.S. should have concentrated more on developing Latin America. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the immigration issue in America is economic problems of Latin America and other parts of the world. Immigration is a way for people to escape poverty and repression and other things. Every time there has been a war, there has been a much more massive migration to Europe or to America. So I always have argued, I said, if you want to stop excessive immigration, you have to create conditions for the people to be able to stay in their own countries. I do believe, this I believe firmly, nobody wants to leave
Yes.
his or her homeland if they can have a reasonable life, you know.
Yeah.
So this question, unfortunately, is looked upon um, in a very wrong way, rather than seeing immigration a kind of economic and social crisis. They look at it as these people are coming and are destroying our culture and so
Yeah.
in fact, I'll tell you something, you might enjoy this. Arnold Toynbee,
Yeah.
and this is, you know, the great historian, because I remember when I was in London in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, that was the time of the Enoch Powell. And they were still then, there were very few immigrants in the UK from Muslim countries and
Mhm.
like subcontinent or Middle East. But still, the emotions were rising. And uh, Toynbee said, he says, immigration is the punishment for the sin of colonialization.
Wow.
It was very good. He said, you colonize them. I mean, for example, you colonize these people and their
Yeah.
normal development was sort of interrupted or whatever, and now they don't have anywhere else to go, and they have to come here. That's
Exactly.
and you see, so these issues are so complex. But the problem is that ordinary person cannot be expected to be knowledgeable about all these things.
Exactly. Yeah. But tell me one thing. So, if you look at the last century, there's two revolutions that we can say were like complete revolutions: the revolution in China and the revolution in Iran. Um,
Yes.
and if you look at the revolution in Iran, like what what do you think made Iran so fertile for that revolution? Because other countries, even in the Middle East, other countries have tried similar things, but it's not been that kind of a revolution. Whether you think of that revolution as a good thing or a bad thing, but my question is, what made Iran so um, kind of um, fertile for that revolution?
Well, I would. This is my understanding, and I am perhaps. I don't. I don't uh, think that my view is necessarily the correct one. I just. I've lived through it, and but I can just. There are several things. One of them was the kind of diversity that I told you,
Mhm.
especially this break or this dichotomy between Iran and Islam. And also, you have to realize that Shia Islam is different
Yes.
than the Sunni Islam.
I'm wondering as
Uh,
well. I was wondering that did that play a part in it? Do you think?
oh, a great part. A great part. Firstly, historically, in the Sunni political context, the clergy were more or less part of the government. You know, in the Ottoman Empire, certainly that was the case. In the Shia Islam, the clergy had a different power base. And in many ways, certainly since the collapse of the Safavid Empire, the clergy were rivals of the government. I talk about these things in my book because my grandmother's uncle, maternal uncle, was a very prominent Shia clergy, and his encounters with the king and so on. I recount the stories that my grandmother used to tell me. Because in Shiism, political power, any form of political power, until the return of the Mahdi or the 12th Imam, is illegitimate.
Yes.
And according to the fifth Imam, Jafar Sadiq, who really he is the ideologue of the Shia fiqh and everything. The Shias only have to have a very, how shall I say, a very loose compromise with the government. And the government's legitimacy is only if they apply the Islamic rule. Well, if you wanted in Iran, this started before the Pahlavis, but the, the necessity of modernization, the necessity of modernization meant that you had to limit the power of the clergy. And this already started a conflict between the clergy and the government, political power. And, with Reza Shah coming to power in 1926, 27, and starting on a modernization process, this competition really became very strong. There were revolts and so on. For example, when he abolished the veil for women, which the Islamic Republic brought it back, he secularized education, which was necessary. This meant that some clergies, lost certain jobs. He secularized the judiciary and so on and so forth. But he also tried to revive because he needed a new sort of ideological framework for his modernization strategy. And he also started to revive the pre-Islamic Iranian traditions and so on. And in fact, Iran became much more prominent as a focus of identity and so on. And in the 1930s and 40s, there was a massive surge of Iranian nationalism and so on. And this continued into the uh, uh, um, Mohammad Reza's uh, rule. And then he made some, I think, unnecessary provocations, like changing the Iranian calendar from the Hijri to starting from the founding of the Persian Empire, by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC and whatever. And this really made the clergy go ballistic because you see, it wasn't just that they were losing, it wasn't just because they loved Islam, but they were losing their grip on the society. So you
Yeah.
already had this split, and then they started using Islam as an ideological weapon against the Pahlavis. And of course, there were mistakes done. I mean, you cannot um, reform a country that is literally medieval at the time when Reza Shah started in 50, 60 years into a European country. But people's expectations were high. So you had what I call the revolution of rising expectations that they couldn't. So this is one element. The other
Yeah.
element was the strength of the left in Iran. The communistic ideologies had penetrated Iran very deeply, and the Russians have been, they were clergy that were communists. I mean, I know this. I think the current leader is communist. I mean, he doesn't say it, but I think his tendencies, I mean, why he hates America so much. I mean, we have all complaints about great power, including the
Yeah.
United States, but the hatred, I mean, the visceral hatred that is willing to endanger people's lives and their well-being, and by not even talking to the Americans, it goes beyond the normal. So the left was also part of that. But I think that ultimately what I call as the catalyst, frankly, was the oil revolution of 1973 and the Shah's unfortunately very hawkish attitude towards oil prices. And also, I have said this, people don't realize, people think that Shah was very close to Israel and so on. That is not so. It is that the Shah was forced to because he knew that Americans otherwise would be on his back if he didn't. But after the 1967 war, he really did become worried about Israel. What is Israel up to? Taking Arab lands. It's what Israel changed from a small country to give refuge to persecuted Jews into a kind of a territorially expansionist country. And by 74, and I was in Geneva at the time, I was in the diplomatic service, uh, the Shah was reevaluating its strategy, was trying to reach out to some of the Arabs, including the more radical ones, because they were very much involved in funding opposition in Iran. I mean, they funded the Egyptians, Jamal Abdel Nasser, of course, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and so on. So the Shah was trying to, make a deal with them, and this made the Israelis angry.
Yeah.
And I think that the Carter administration basically gave up on the Shah. And so this emboldened, whether they did it intentionally
Because
or whether it was just evolved in that direction is hard to say. But I think
yeah.
that, and then there's one other element that people don't realize is that Shah's illness. By 74, Shah had cancer. So he was not the Shah of the 1960s and so on.
Who
And
was the crown prince? Was there like a strong crown
Crown
prince at
Prince
that
was
time?
still a child. Crown Prince
Mm.
was, I don't know, he is now 60 something. So in 1979,
Because
46 years, he was
because the
14 or so. But you see, the problem, this is what I'm saying. The Americans essentially decided that the Shah has um,
served his
his
purpose.
was it sell-by date expired. His sell-by date expired, and they convinced them that somehow that the clergy will not be in power, and that
Yeah.
they will have what I have called in some places Mossadegh light, like Bazargan and so on. And so you will have a more pliable Iranian government And the Barzani government did those things, for example, So all these things are in the book. So I think that yes, there were a lot of internal causes for this,
Yeah,
but I
because
think that it was inevitable. It was not inevitable, and I do believe that the American policy played a significant role. And of course,
yes,
it's
as you're
yes,
as you're explaining this, and thank you so much. I'm just looking at like parallels with other countries. So, for example, so you're talking about mistakes that the government made. But if you look at like other governments, like whether it's Egyptian Hosni Mubarak or Bashar al-Assad, we see similar, not similar, but we see massive mistakes there in their own kind of context. And then if we look at like the Russian leaning aspect of politics, you kind of find that in other countries as well. And then they attempted at different times, different countries attempted revolution, but it was never successful. And I'm thinking a couple of things that you've mentioned. One is that the sheer nature of the Iranian culture, maybe that has something to do with it. And also how you mentioned that at the time, um, oil was being discovered and became a big thing. So maybe it was like a perfect storm. But I'm just surprised that a similar thing has a revolution has been tried and even been tried to be exported from Iran, but it's never been so successful as it has been in Iran. So why is it? Is it just the right circumstances? All of them came together at the right time.
yeah. Well, I think that, to be honest, in my humble opinion, I don't think the revolution has been successful. If you
Mm.
look at the results of the revolution, Iran is now worse off than it was in 1979. I mean, Turkey in
No,
1979 was way below Iran. South Korea and Iran were at the same level, whereas now Iran, in some ways, has become a basket case. I mean, really,
yes,
when I read this stuff, I feel very much. I think that part of it is that the government, the people who came, I think that they just had a better organizing principle, and
yes,
they really, I think that organized themselves quite well. And unfortunately, the hardliners managed to eliminate the more moderate groups. And part of it was because the other elements were in constant competition with one another.
yes,
The left and the more liberal people fought one another. So, in a
yes,
way, the religious hardliners um,
yes,
triumph by default. And I, I personally don't think that Iran's revolution has been successful. Of course, I mean, I wrote an article, I don't know, it was in the 1980s sometime, for something called Third World Quarter. And I said in that why Iran's revolution cannot be exported. There are two factors. One of them is that in the Muslim world, Iranians are very alone culturally and ethnically.
mhm,
They are basically surrounded by countries and groups that see them, if not as enemy, as rival.
mm,
Arabs don't care for the Persians particularly. Turks dislike the Persians. Pashtuns hate Persians. I mean, so yeah. And then you have the Sunni Shia split.
yeah,
If the Iranian Revolution had happened in a Sunni country, I think that would have swept a
that's
lot.
great. Yes, I think
But
you're right. So when I talk about the revolution being successful, I don't mean it was successful as for the country. It's not a judgment that it made the country better. I'm just saying it was successful in terms of it was self-sustaining, that is now 4 decades on, and also successful in revolutions. They say revolution uh, is a complete change of society in a way. So from that point of view, whether that change is good or bad is a different thing, but it's kind of changed the Iranian culture completely, and it's sustained itself for such a long time. So when I talk about it being successful, that's kind of what I'm kind of
Well, I
leading
would
to.
say that it has not really changed the Iranian culture. In fact, one of the interesting things is about the resilience of Iranian culture.
Mm.
Um, the same way that many of the Iranian traditions acquired an Islamic veneer after the Arab invasion, but they remained what they were. And one of the things that has happened, which I find it really very encouraging, there has been a resurgence actually of Iranian nationalism. Iranian music, for example, has survived. They had to adapt it to certain limitations that the government has set. Um, but I think that Iranians have always managed to have a life separate from what the government wants. Under the
Yeah,
Shah, the religious people kept their own religious lifestyle, even though the government was promoting very much of Islamic, um, no, of a secular vision. After
mm,
the revolution, the first decade, yes, the first decade there was this very enthusiasm and so on and so forth. But I think that one of the things I think that helped revive Iranian nationalism was the Iraqi invasion of Iran.
yeah,
Even the government had to do that. Every time the government is in trouble, it resorts to Iranian sense of
mm,
patriotism.
yeah,
Even, for example, I remember some time ago when it was during the election, um, the Ayatollah Khamenei or somebody else has said, even if you don't like the system, participate for the sake of Iran. So
yeah.
for people still Iran, the other thing that the culture has remained strong is just that is how the Iranian people are. And I think that the diaspora, I mean, I think that, the digital world has created an amazing revolution. I mean, you can go, the governments can ban certain music or they can ban
Mm,
certain films and so on. And if you have even a minimum internet access, you can go to YouTube and watch whatever you want. So that's why I
yeah,
have always said that the idea of banning anything in this day and age is just stupid and
yeah. Unproductive.
self. But I have to tell you that I am worried about the future of Iran. I am very
Mm,
worried about the future of Iran, especially if the government is incapable of making the adjustments and the compromises. They have to make compromises. If they are incapable of doing that, I am very much so. And of course, if something happens to Iran, the aftershocks will be felt in other parts of the region
definitely,
as
yeah,
well.
definitely. Dr. Jane, tell me one thing. So you mentioned like the modernization attempts that the Shah was doing, and
Mhm.
as a result, maybe he went a bit over the line and caused problems. I'm looking at like similar parallels happening now with Saudi Arabia with uh, Mohammed bin um, Mohammed
Salman.
bin Salman, trying to modernize, trying to um, westernize, trying to bring the country forward in his kind of image. Um,
Mhm.
how do you see that kind of panning out with the knowledge that you have about what happened in Iran? Do you think he's going to be successful? What dangers are there?
Well, to be honest with you, I think that the great variable is going to be how Ben Salman manages to navigate the current problems in the Middle East, especially related to the Gaza and the Palestinian problem. Saudi Arabia does not have the same kind of fault lines that Iran has. There is no Arabism opposing Islam, Arabism and Islam. I mean, the Prophet was the greatest glory of the Arabs. Before that, there was not much. You had Iran, you had Rome, you had Greece, but nothing much there. So I don't think that they have the same problems that Iran has. Secondly, Saudi Arabia has immense wealth. Iran didn't have that. They have relatively small population and immense wealth. So, and the other thing is that Americans have a different attitude to Saudi Arabia. They will not play the kind of games that they played with Iran and the Shah, which brings me back to the American factor. So I think the only thing that could derail all these things is if Saudi Arabia goes out of line regarding its support of the Palestinians or so. And so that is, I think, the most significant challenge for Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Um, so And they, I mean, Saudi Arabia doesn't, there is no Soviet Union, which was working against the Shah at the time, even though officially they had good relations, but underneath, they were instigating troubles through the Tudeh party and others. There is no Soviet Union, and Putin is not going to do anything to undermine King Salman, or President Xi is not going to do anything to. So I think that
No.
the biggest challenge for Ben Salman is this very narrow Middle East confine, and how
I think he's got
they
like
can navigate.
I
Yes,
think he has
please.
like challenges of like the conservative, religious, and tribal nature of Saudi Arabia itself. There's so many now Islamic jurisprudence and theologians in prison. So from that point of view, I think he's got like a challenge. I'd be interested to know your views about how significant Gaza and Palestine is inside of Saudi Arabia. Um, does it play a role in the politics in Saudi Arabia, or is it insignificant because the media is controlled and maybe people don't get as much of a say?
Well, I think that to be honest with you, I am not as knowledgeable about Saudi Arabia as I am about Iran and some other areas.
Yeah,
So I will have to be a little bit careful in expressing opinions. That my own feeling is that, the Saudi clergy don't have very independent base. I mean, they
mm,
were always kind of twins of the Al Saud family and so on. I personally think that Ben Salman doesn't care much for Gaza. I mean, if he cared, they would have done something before. It
yeah,
is his father, King Salman, that has emotionally attached to that. So I don't think Saudi Arabia will do anything outside of the what overall Arab consensus can become. So they're not going to challenge the United States, because notwithstanding the newfound relations with China and so on, Saudi Arabia still is dependent on the United States for its
yeah,
security.
yeah,
China doesn't want to become involved. China is very careful. China of today is not the Soviet Union of the 1950s and 60s. China wants to expand its influence without incurring any costs.
mm,
And the same thing now is for Russia, except for, Ukraine and those Belarus and whatever. So I think that King Salman will walk a very fine line. It will depend also if the Israelis do not overstep their ambitions. I mean, one of the things that obviously has rattled Prince Salman is the Netanyahu's statement that a Palestinian state should be established in Saudi Arabia. So this generates certain fear about
yeah,
the long-term plans or ambitions of Israel to see the big countries of the Middle East disintegrate into smaller entities. There has been ideas regarding that. But so I think that I don't think it is going to be very much, at least in the foreseeable future. Of course, we have to not forget that even in 1978, nobody would have thought that you will have a revolution in Iran.
Yeah,
Iran was the up and
exactly,
coming country and so
exactly.
on. So
I think right.
anything is possible under the sun. But
Yeah,
if we,
I'd
if
like to
we,
ask you.
yes, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'd like to ask you lastly that Iran is a great historic civilization, very proud civilization. And it's the same with the Turks. The Turks are very historic, very proud civilization. They're both on the crossroads of different civilizations. They're both non-Arabs. They're both Muslims. Why don't they have a stronger bond? And they could be a great power.
Well, they will not. To begin with, especially to begin with, the Turk-Persian fault line is also very, very strong. I
Mm.
mean, don't forget that Mongols and Turks are the same ethnic group, and the
Yeah,
Turks basically devastated Iran. I mean, and they. Turks also have a certain, they know that the Ottoman civilization was very much influenced by the Seljuks, which were
yeah,
Turkic people who dominated, of course, Iran as well. But the Seljuk civilization was based on the ancient Iranian civilization. I mean,
mm,
everything, Malik Shah, I mean, Khaja Nizam al-Mulk and all that and so on. And even in the Ottoman court, they used to speak Persian in the old days. So there is this
mm,
basic thing. Then there is the sectarian difference.
yeah,
Uh, the sectarian difference is, I mean, don't forget the fights of the Safavids. The Safavids were also essentially Turkic.
mm,
And the reason they were fighting was because of sectarian and, of course, because of expansionist ideas and so on. And so Turks, particularly, in fact, it's funny that the Iran-Turkey relations have been far more strained under the Erdogan regime than it was with the secular government. Under the Shah, Iran and Turkey had a reasonably good relations. But after the Iranian Revolution, first when Turkey was still secular, Turks manipulated the Iranian factor in order to make themselves look better. I
mm,
remember Tansu Çiller everywhere. Europe has to choose between a progressive Turkey and a reactionary Iran and so on. So that is a very strong element in there. Um, and Turks have irredentist claims towards Iran, not directly, but so I don't think it's going. This is why I am so critical of Iran's foreign policy. A country that is so existentially lonely. If
yeah,
something happens to Iran, there is no organization of Iranian states to at least issue a resolution to say, as the Arab League does or something else. Iran is lonely, and so
yeah,
for a government like for somebody, a leader like Khamenei, he doesn't care about Iran. Khomeini didn't care about Iran. All for him was Islam. He used Iran as a headquarters for a revolutionary movement. And I can
yeah,
never forgive that. And the problem is that if you have a sudden collapse of government in Iran, I do not believe that Iran will survive.
yeah,
I do not. I do not. It will fracture. And then, if that fractures, then you will have all kinds of civil wars beginning everywhere, including in Turkey, in Kurdish areas or in Baluchistan. I mean, Pakistan and Iranian Baluchistan could
yeah,
become one and the same. And And so that's why that, in my opinion, Iran has to be kept as is. But the problem is that at the moment, Iranian leaders, I mean, I don't mean Iranian leaders. It is unfair to put everybody in one basket.
Yeah,
There are people who care for Iran. I mean, Khatami, for example, cared for Iran. Rafsanjani cared for Iran. And so there is this group of hardliners, which unfortunately the leader is on top of it. They don't care, just don't
yeah,
care. I don't know what it is, or is it that they are forced to by some great power or something? I have no idea. This is escapes me because everything I have learned, both as a student of international affairs and as also a foreign service officer, the foreign policy of Iranian government does not make sense. I mean, when Arabs are not willing to do anything for Palestinians, why should Iran destroy its own country just for the sake of Palestinians? My heart bleeds for them. It really does, like for any human being, because when you
yeah,
see all the things that is happening, but if I am the leader of a country, my first duty is to my own people.
yeah.
And what he's doing, the Iranian children are dying because of the sanctions and lack of drugs. And so I am very depressed about the whole situation, and of course international politics. I mean, I have to say, in all fairness, um, the Iranian government on several occasions tried to approach the United States and make a deal. But unfortunately, the US did not respond, in part, in great part, because of the Israeli pressures. And so
I've heard that
Iran,
now Trump is willing to start some negotiation with Iran. There's even talks about possibility of a USA embassy in Iran. Have you heard
uh,
about that?
I haven't even heard about that. I wish that they would, but my own fear is that the conditions that they are going to demand from Iran
Mm.
is going to be such that will preclude any kind of agreement. Because I
Mm.
do believe that Israel wants basically Iran's destruction.
Yeah,
It's not even regime change, it's destruction.
yeah,
Israel doesn't want. Is Israel's problem is not solely with the regime. It is with Iran as a country, a
mm,
large country, sitting between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf,
yeah,
and with the potential for growth and everything. And that they don't want, because this is not all about the survival of Israel. It's about power,
yes,
power and domination. And uh, and I think that that is Iran, missed opportunities, I think. But in general, also, what happened was that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the Western world's interest in Iran diminished. The reason they wanted Iran to stay was because they didn't want it to come under the Soviet domination. But now they don't care. I mean, look, Iran has close relations with Russia, but nothing has happened. Russians are not going to do anything. Russians are not going to help Iran. So I think that I really don't know. There is a saying in the old days, anyway, when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, that uh, only God protects Iran. So this has never been more true than today, because the conditions uh, are for Iran are very, very dire, and it requires a lot of courage on the part of Iranians to
yeah,
take difficult. But one thing I have to do before I finish, I am not sure even if the Iranians accepted all the Americans' conditions, they will let Iran alone, or they will lift the sanctions already, because that is also what it is. This is what actually the people who oppose talks with the US are saying.
Yeah,
Saying that, no matter
they have
what
a
we
point.
do, they are good. Yes, they have a point. You see, no matter what we do, they will come with a different excuse.
Yeah,
So they will find it, or if we give up the nuclear, they will talk about the missile. We give up the missiles, they will talk about something else. We give up that, they will talk about human rights. I mean, it's really
yes,
no end. There's no end.
yes.
And so this is that we have to stay put. So it's very dangerous. I mean, they really because of the uncertainties, there is really no good option. I still
There's no good
believe that
option. You're right.
no, despite this, I still believe that the Iranians should test the Americans' sincerity that they want a deal, because
Mm.
refusing to talk, it
Yes,
only makes them look, the guilty party.
yeah,
Uh, but uh, but I can and I understand those who would counter my argument that, well, we tried several times, look what happened, and if we do this, then they will want something more.
yeah. Dr. Shing, thank you so much for your time and the analysis. It is really insightful. I'd love to have you back again one day, and let's talk about like Iran's relations with Pakistan, the Balochistan problem, and also the Pashtun problem with and Afghanistan.
Yes,
I think this Iran is a fascinating place, and because as we say, because it's in crossroads of civilizations,
that's right.
it's very different issues going on in Pakistan and in Afghanistan to the Middle East, but still very important.
Of course, of course. Well, thank you so much. It was pleasure talking to you. I have to say that, Kian is a Persian word.
I've been wanting to say to you, my ancestors are also from Iran. From Iran, they moved to Afghanistan and then they settled in what's now
Which
Pakistan.
part of Iran, do you know?
No, but apparently my family, you know the book Shahnameh, my family is mentioned in that.
Well, Kianian, they were some of the mythical dynasties of Iran. And
Yes,
Kian means honor and glory and all that.
yes,
Okay.
yes. I'd love
Well,
to,
that's
yes, I'd love to hear more, talk to you more about that because just from that point of view as well, from an ancestral point of view, I love Iran and
of
Iranian
course.
people.
Iran is worthy of love. Unfortunately, a lot of the people don't realize that.
Yeah.
Well, good day to you. روز شما
Thank you so
بخیر.
much.